History is full of tyrants whose cruelty defies belief, and Saddam Hussein was definitely one of those dudes. A dictator who waged chemical war on his own citizens, ordered mass executions, and crushed dissent with a brutality that still scars Iraq to this very day. Yet for all of Saddam's savagery, he was still, in a dark way, a calculating man. His violence served a purpose, cementing his grip on power. His oldest son, Uday, however, well, he was something else entirely. Born in 1964, Uday Saddam Hussein grew up in the shadow of his father's iron rule, showered with wealth, privilege, and unchecked power. By his teens, he was already infamous in Baghdad for his temper and excesses. By his 20s, he had built a reputation not as a ruler in waiting, but as a sadist, a man who killed for amusement, who treated rape as a hobby, who used sport and spectacle as tools of torture. Where Saddam's violence was political, Uday's was personal, unpredictable, and horrifyingly public. But to appreciate just how monstrous Uday truly was, we need some context. We first need to look at the man who raised him. Saddam Hussein al-Majid al-Tikriti was born in 1937 near Tikrit and rose through the Ba'ath Party as an enforcer. Come 1968, he was suitably up there in the hierarchy that he was able to help engineer the coup that removed President Abdul Rahman Arif from power. Then in 1979, following the abdication of President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and the acquisition of considerable power behind the scenes, Saddam took his place, and he'd keep it for 24 years, all the way until 2003. And he started how he meant to continue, absolutely brutally. You see, mere days into his presidency, Saddam convened a party congress where he read out a list of supposed traitors who, one by one, were dragged from the hall and immediately put against a wall and shot. And what would you know it? They all just happened to be people who may have threatened his position once the initial honeymoon period of his ascendancy had worn off. And this became a common theme of his rule. Dissent of any kind was nipped in the bud oh so very quickly, brutally, and with overwhelming force. Take the town of Dajjal as an example. As there in 1982, he had 148 people massacred following a failed assassination attempt, and he bulldozed 250,000 acres of orchards to leave the survivors destitute. Fuck hell, dude, what the salt the earth while you're at it, bro. Externally, he plunged Iraq into the 8-year Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, a meat grinder that may have killed somewhere in the region of 1.5 million people across both sides. And what's worse, when the tide turned against his favor, he had his forces deploy chemical munitions, mustard gas, and nerve agents, not just on Iranian troops, but on his own citizens. It happened as part of the 1987 to 1989 Anfal campaign against the Kurds, a calculated program of mass terror designed to quash Kurdish aspirations of statehood and bring them back to heel under Baghdad's foot, with the foul high point of the whole campaign being the 1988 Halabja massacre, where as many as 5,000 were killed and twice that number were injured again in the single chemical attack. The death toll for the whole campaign was somewhere between 50 and 182,000, depending on who you ask. And then in August 1990, he started another war when he invaded neighboring Kuwait in the hopes of seizing the nation's sizable oil reserves that would allow him to right the Iraqi economy, which had been absolutely devastated by the Iran-Iraq War. That, however, proved to be a little bit of a strategic misstep, because as part of Operation Desert Storm, a coalition of 42 nations proceeded to absolutely obliterate his military, which was then the fourth largest on Earth. And it did it in 43 days, of course, forcing a withdrawal from any occupied territory. This, perhaps unsurprisingly, sparked uprisings, which Saddam answered with helicopter gunships, summary executions, and a grinding campaign of revenge. The southern marshes, the cradle of ancient Mesopotamian culture, were deliberately drained to punish the marsh Arabs, and in the cities, his forces ran torture centers with a monotony that only bureaucracy could supply. Beatings, electric shocks, amputations, even rape. It was all deployed with unrelenting enthusiasm. So yeah, it's safe to say that Saddam Hussein, a little bit of a monster, wasn't he? But, like we said at the beginning, he has nothing on his son, because whereas Saddam was fundamentally a Machiavellian, a man who unleashed the foul wickedness he did to preserve and expand his power, Uday, well, he was just a sadist, and nowhere was that sadism more apparent than in his ledger of killings. Take, for example, a palace party back in 1988. There was music blaring, the plonk was flowing, and Uday was surrounded by his usual orbit of courtiers desperate to win his favor and, via it, his father's. Right at his side, though, was Kamal Hana Gageo, his bodyguard and food taster. On that day, Kamal was not in Uday's good books, chiefly because he'd been sending ladies Saddam's way, much to the chagrin of his first wife and Uday's mother, Sajida Talfar. His response to this slight? Well, that would be remaining cool, and then out of nowhere, as far as onlookers were concerned, standing up, grabbing a club, and proceeding to beat him to a bloody pulp over the course of several minutes before eventually delivering a kill shot between the eyes with his pistol. This wasn't just any party either. It was a high-level diplomatic function, with Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak being in attendance. He witnessed the whole thing and simply described Uday as, and we'll quote him here, a psychopath. Saddam, for his part, was furious when he found out, as Kamal had been a trusted confidant and a reliable man that cared for him. But while he had originally wanted to imprison Uday by way of punishment, an already rather light and nepotistic punishment, all things considered, Sajida instead managed to talk him down to merely exiling him to Switzerland. In other words, Uday's punishment for murdering an important man in cold blood was an all-expenses-paid holiday until 1990, because then, with Uday having gotten involved in a nightclub altercation that saw him draw an unlicensed firearm and physically assault a police officer, they declared him persona non grata and shipped him back to Iraq. And when there, no longer bound by the need to at least try and behave to prevent a diplomatic incident, he soon enough slipped back into his old, fully sadistic ways. For an example of just how wanton his violence could be, consider a 1995 Hussein family party in Tikrit. There, the wine had been flowing, and the mood was light, until Uday turned up late, drunk, and already simmering with hatred for his uncle, Interior Minister Watban Ibrahim. Soon enough, he whipped out a sub-machine gun that it had holstered under his jacket and began spraying fire wildly in Watban's general direction, with him taking a burst in the leg so savage that it had to be amputated. But at least he survived, which is more than can be said for 6 young women stood around him, because they were killed on the spot. And they were the ones that nobody outside the palace ever read about. The staff, the drivers, the guards, the common folk who just so happened to be in range when Uday's temper snapped. A chef once oversalted a dish. Uday spat out the first mouthful, stood up, and shot him in the chest right there in the kitchen. The guests carried on eating dessert while the body was dragged away. That was the etiquette. Act like nothing had happened, or you might be next. Once, one of his drivers took a wrong turn on the way to a nightclub. Uday stepped out of the car, pulled him into the street, and beat him to death with a pistol butt while traffic piled up behind. Nobody honked, nobody moved, everyone understood the rules. Bodyguards were expendable too. In 1997, crippled after an assassination attempt that left him walking with a cane, Uday turned on one of his own protectors. The man had dared look him in the eye. That was it. Uday drew his sidearm and shot him dead on the spot, leaving the corpse for the other guards to clear away. Servants vanished with the same frequency as dishes from the kitchen. One butler was rumoured to have broken a glass during dinner service. He never came back. Party guests were fair game as well, as in the ones he meant to kill. At one reception, for example, Uday took offence that a young man hadn't laughed loudly enough at one of his jokes. He pulled out his gold-plated pistol and shot him in the head in front of the crowd. Music started up again before the blood was even dry. Even strangers on the street were not safe. His convoys tore through Baghdad like rolling execution squads. If a car didn't move aside fast enough, the unlucky driver could be dragged out, beaten senseless by his guards, and sometimes left dead in the gutter as a warning to everyone else. Parents taught their children to flatten themselves against the walls when they heard the sirens. Survival was a matter of distance from Uday's line of sight. It was this steady drip of small killings, the staff, the servants, the drivers, the random bystanders, that made him even more feared than Saddam himself. Because if the dictator's wrath was political, his son's was personal, and personal could mean anyone. Worse still, though, he didn't just kill with his own hands. He also built an army to do it for him. They were the Fedayeen Saddam, founded in 1995, and best remembered today for their natty Darth Vader-inspired helmets, the same ones that everyone posted to Iraqi freedom back in 2003 was trying to snag. A private militia under Uday's personal control, they were less soldiers and more state-approved thugs, with their jobs being the enforcing of fear. When ordered, they staged executions so grotesque that Baghdad still whispers about them today. One such scene took place in a Baghdad schoolyard in 1995. There, 2 men accused of helping rebels were dragged out before an assembled crowd of hundreds. Their tongues were torn out with pliers before their heads were hacked off with a scimitar. The whole thing was also filmed for Uday's private collection. The same year, women accused of supposed immorality began to vanish. They reappeared hours later on their families' doorsteps, or rather their heads did, delivered in sacks, mouths gagged, hair matted with blood. The message couldn't have been clearer. If Uday or his militia decreed you a prostitute, you were one, and you were dead. Sometimes, though, it was about theatre and spectacle. One eyewitness described how a Fedayeen squad set up in a marketplace surrounded by loudspeakers. They then dragged in a man accused of theft, broke his arms with iron bars, and then shot him through the skull in front of the vendors. Afterwards, the crowd was ordered to cheer. Those who didn't clap fast enough were dragged into trucks and never came back. There was also Najaf in 1999, where the Fedayeen paraded 3 men naked through the streets before setting them on fire. Their crime? Whispering their dislike of Saddam in a cafe. In Basra, whole families were taken because one son had deserted. Mothers, fathers, siblings executed en masse in a warehouse, their bodies unceremoniously dumped in the river. Uday's militia also patrolled the highways. Drivers unlucky enough to be pulled over were robbed, beaten, sometimes executed on the roadside. One survivor recalled seeing 2 men hanged from a bridge by their ankles, throats slit, left swinging as traffic passed beneath. The sheer randomness of these killings, it left Iraq paralyzed. A woman might be accused of adultery, a boy of desertion, a merchant of hoarding, and that was enough. They'd be dragged into a square, a knife would be raised, a camera would be rolling. Heads were mounted on poles, bodies were dumped in skips. The city told to learn a lesson, and it worked. Parents kept children inside, neighbors stopped talking, whole districts fell silent when the Darth Vader helmeted squads rolled in, because everyone knew those helmets answered not to the law, not to the party, not even to Saddam, but to Uday alone, and they were nothing if not crafted in their maker's image. And then there's the matter of his sexual sins, because let's not wrap this, of all things, in flowery language. Let's just say it how it was. He was a mass serial rapist, one who used his nigh untouchable status within Iraq to have who he wanted, where he wanted, when he wanted. No better is this displayed than in his taste for taking newly wedded brides before their wedding nights. Basically, if he spotted a bride he liked the look of, then and there, oftentimes on the very steps of the mosque, his thugs would drag her away and have her delivered to him later that same day. It appears to be something that he acquired a bit of a taste for in the late 80s, with the book I Was Saddam's Son, penned not by Uday himself, but by Latif Yahya, one of his body doubles, going into far more detail than we're willing to today. Long story short, though, mere minutes after he was finished with his first victim, she was dead, having fallen from a balcony and smashed down onto the pavement below. Was she thrown? Did she throw herself after being overcome by torment? We don't know. Latif wasn't privy to that information. What he did mention, however, was how her husband took it very, very badly, and after turning up to confront Uday personally, trumped-up charges of treason appeared, and the husband was promptly executed before he could spread word of his wife's suffering around Iraq. Another incident, dated to 2002, saw him have an 18-year-old bride snatched straight from her own wedding reception. Latif, relaying information he himself got from a palace maid, recounts the scene. The girl locked in the bathroom, crying, resisting, and later screaming as Uday took her. Again, the exact cause of her death is unknown, but we can be pretty sure it was Uday's hand, as the aforementioned maid, when summoned to clean up, caught a glimpse of the girl's corpse being carried out and wrapped in a blanket, with just enough of her remains visible to tell that her face and shoulders had been burnt away with acid. And then there was the scene she found in the room, a bed covered in blood and hair. Uday's one sentence to her upon bearing witness to this scene: "Speak of this, and you and your family will be finished." Latif also describes a third incident where, at a wedding reception, the lights were suddenly cut upon Uday's entry. When they came back on, the bride was gone, and the husband, knowing exactly what had happened, simply grabbed a pistol and shot himself under the chin, then and there, falling dead on the dance floor. Brides weren't his only women of choice, though. No. It was any woman who he fancied the look of, and he had a system for it. Guards, drivers, courtiers after his favour, they all became recruiters, prowling universities, nightclubs, even schools, with the obvious age-related implication therefrom. They'd bring names, photos, addresses, and if Uday liked what he saw, a convoy was dispatched. Girls were pulled off buses, out of classrooms, off sidewalks. They were bundled into cars, crying, kicking, muffled by armed men, and everyone on the street looked away because everyone knew exactly what was happening. He did try his hand at coercion from time to time too, with Latif recalling one particular incident from 1998 when, after barging his way into a high school party, a 14-year-old girl in a yellow dress caught his eye. Then, his men approached her with offers, diamonds, a car. Just come congratulate Uday for 10 minutes. She refused. They grabbed her. She was gone for 3 days. And when she came home, she had a new dress, a new watch, a wad of cash, and empty. dead to the world eyes. A later medical examination confirmed the obvious. Her father tried to complain, in response to which he was told to hand both his daughters over, the 14-year-old and her 12-year-old sister, or his family would be wiped from the earth, and he obeyed. This was the level of terror. Mothers hid daughters indoors when Uday was rumoured to be nearby. Shops locked their doors. Female students barricaded themselves in bathrooms when his convoy rolled onto campus. Because once Uday wanted you, that was it. One woman summed it up: no one could escape Uday's lust. He even gave himself a nickname for the role: Abu Saran, or the Father of Wolves. To facilitate it all, Uday maintained what everyone soon referred to as his pleasure palaces. One was hidden inside Saddam's presidential compound: gaudy fountains, velvet sofas, erotic murals, everything you would expect from one with such foul habits as his. That one in particular was also the one that was raided by US forces in 2003, who found shelves stuffed with narcotics and HIV testing kits, which, if you were wondering, were for Uday's benefit, as apparently he demanded blood tests before he would do so much as even touch his victims. And if they refused, death, usually through gunfire, a single round if Uday was supposedly feeling merciful, or an entire magazine's worth if he was feeling particularly jilted. If he was proactively enraged, then it would be a slow, painful death through torture. There was another angle to it all too, as Uday also weaponized his rape, oftentimes targeting the daughters of rich and powerful Iraqis, making sure to film the whole vile ordeal and film it all for later use as blackmailing material. Tragically, Iraq adapted to all this. Families stopped reporting missing girls. Fathers told themselves their daughters were visiting relatives. Mothers prayed their child would be overlooked. Silence became survival, because if you resisted, well, you couldn't. Not really. So Uday liked to call himself the patron of Iraqi sport, and certainly there can be no doubting that he really was into his sports, like fanatically so, and indeed he did direct no small amount of resources into the nation's athletics. By the early 1990s, he had stacked titles like trophies: chairman of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, president of the Iraqi Football Federation, boss of clubs and federations across the country. But such patronage wasn't exactly what you'd call benign. Latif explains it best in his book, describing how the Olympic Committee building in Baghdad was a split-level nightmare. Upstairs, he wrote, the walls were covered with plaques, posters, trophies, and photographs. Downstairs were the cells. There was no daylight, only cement, filth, and guards waiting for orders. In short, Iraq's athletes either delivered results or they were brutalized. Players who missed penalties or conceded goals were dragged in, shackled, and beaten on the soles of their feet with cables. Latif recalled seeing footballers emerge crawling, their feet so swollen they couldn't stand. If you failed, he wrote, your punishment was falaqwa, 100, 200, 500 lashes on the feet. They were marked down like scores on a blackboard. Humiliation was part of the show too. Entire squads had their heads shaved before being forced into punishing training sessions in the blazing heat, collapsing under exhaustion while guards laughed. Latif remembered one national team midfielder who dared to argue back. Uday had him suspended by the wrists from a ceiling pipe and flogged until he passed out. And Uday liked to make his presence felt in person too. He would storm into locker rooms, pistol in hand, ranting the players had disgraced Iraq. Latif wrote, I saw him once wave his gun at a goalkeeper. He shouted, miss another ball and I'll break your hands so you never use them again. The keeper simply stood frozen. It wasn't just football. Boxers who lost bouts had their ribs smashed by iron bars. Wrestlers were shackled in stress positions for days. Weightlifters were forced to hold impossible poses until their muscles gave way and they collapsed. The punishment was always the same: torture disguised as training, injury disguised as discipline. One of the most infamous cases came in 1997 after Iraq lost a World Cup qualifier. The entire squad was rounded up and locked in the Olympic Committee cells for days. Guards took turns thrashing them, and when Uday appeared, he sneered that they were donkeys unfit to wear Iraq's shirt. Players later defected and confirmed it all: the lashes, the cells, the humiliation. For Iraqi athletes, representing their country wasn't pride, it was terror. To win meant a car, maybe a house, but to lose meant your body, your career, sometimes your life. Latif summed it up simply as this: Uday turned our sport into his torture chamber. Athletes no longer played to win, they played to survive. Now you're likely wondering, why the hell Uday, a man who bludgeoned Saddam's favourite aide to death in front of Hosni Mubarak, sprayed family parties with bullets and terrorised Baghdad like a gangster in a gold suit, was allowed to get away with it? Why wasn't he put down? Why wasn't he locked away, or at least shoved so far into the background that Iraq could breathe? After all, some dictators need to keep some of their populace happy, lest their entire story ends Mussolini-style, dingle dangling from a lamppost. Well, Saddam was certainly no fool when it came to Uday, and he was fully aware that he was an absolute demon of a man. The murder of Kamal Hanar had humiliated the regime. The drunken rampage that shredded Watban's leg and killed half a dozen young women had blackened the family's name. The abductions and the rapes were whispered about in just about every cafe. Uday wasn't just feared, he was loathed. So again, why did Saddam allow it? Well, it turns out there was a mix of reasons. First, blood came before everything else to Saddam. His grip on power rested on family and tribe. The decrees were his insurance against coups, his private mafia inside the state. As Saeed Aburish points out in The Politics of Revenge, the whole system was wired to protect the family first, no matter how much shame an individual son might bring. If loyalty began with blood, then family had to remain untouchable. Punishing Uday too harshly, executing him, or banishing him permanently would have cracked the facade of unity Saddam built his regime on. Better to absorb the shame than show weakness, or so the logic went. Second, he was the firstborn. In Saddam's tribal code, that mattered. Uday was the crown prince, the spoiled heir, the boy raised to believe Iraq itself would one day be his inheritance. Aburish again stresses this dynastic indulgence, and Latif echoes the same idea when he explains how Uday was showered with power posts from the late 80s onwards, youth organizations, newspapers, even the Olympic Committee. He was treated simply as untouchable. For Saddam to suddenly decide that the chosen son was beyond redemption would have been an admission that the whole succession project had failed. And third, there was Sajida, Saddam's first wife and Uday's mother. Whenever Saddam roared that Uday had gone too far, Sajida pleaded for mercy. Both Latif Yahya and Abbas al-Janabi, Uday's former secretary and later a defector, recalled how she repeatedly stepped in to shield him from potential real punishment, and Saddam, despite his fury, often backed down to keep peace inside the household. Turns out the dictator had entire towns wiped off the map at a whisper of dissent. He was a firm believer in happy wife, happy life. Fourth, Uday was actually useful. Sure, he might have been unstable, but he was effective in one grim sense. He terrified people, and weirdly, he was close enough to the mustachioed man himself that Saddam benefited from some of that terror generally, but was far enough removed that Saddam could dodge some of the blame specifically. Everyone was terrified into public silence, but when they whispered in private dwellings, who were they blaming for it? Saddam, a man who represented the whole system as it then stood, or Uday, a petulant, if sadistic, rich nepo bat? And finally, dynastic politics. By the late 90s, Saddam had already shifted his trust to Qusay, the quieter, steadier younger son. Charles Tripp, in A History of Iraq, makes clear that Qusay was effectively running the security services while Uday was sidelined into media and racketeering. But killing or disowning Uday outright would have meant war inside the palace. Brothers, uncles, cousins, all would have been forced to take sides. In Saddam's mind, letting Uday live as a limping embarrassment was safer than opening a civil war inside his own home. And so Uday stayed, an unstable, widely despised predator, propped up by nothing more than blood ties, a father's pride, and an exceptionally abstract idea of usefulness. And now we have just one last thing we need to tell you about before we close the curtains on today's horrific episode. The end of Uday's story and his very well-deserved death. The Reaper came for him in 2003 during the US invasion of Iraq that shattered Saddam's regime in weeks. Baghdad fell, statues toppled, and Saddam's sons went underground. Both Uday and Qusay fled north, hiding in Tikrit, then Mosul. Posters plastered on walls offered $15 million for information on their whereabouts, and every US soldier in country had a picture of him in their pocket, courtesy of this rather natty deck of cards that everyone wishes they never threw away after seeing what they now go for on eBay. Come the 22nd of July, they had him surrounded in a villa in Mosul. Inside were Uday, Qusay, and Qusay's teenage son. The Americans called for surrender. There was silence, and then there was gunfire. What followed was a 4-hour-long firefight. The villa was raked with heavy machine guns, grenades, even a missile. When the smoke cleared, Uday was lying dead on the floor, his body shredded, Qusay beside him. The US released photos of their corpses to silence rumors. Iraqis stared, and then they cheered. In Baghdad, people fired guns in the air in celebration. Crowds poured onto the streets. One man told a reporter, "Now our daughters can walk free." Their palaces were looted almost immediately. Gold-plated rifles, casks of cognac, shelves of X-rated tapes, garages stacked with Ferraris and Porsches. Cars were torched, stables emptied, walls smashed with hammers. Ordinary Iraqis who had lived in fear for decades finally got their chance to pillage the plunderers. And sure, Iraq's post-Saddam history has been difficult, with some ups and many, many downs, but even then, there is no rose-tinted nostalgia to be found for him, and no one who mourns for him, because even in Iraq, blood-stained and not lacking for competition as its history is, he is remembered as among the worst of them all.